Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics like raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include Dr. Ellie Leibowitz, therapist Ben Kessler, neuropsychologist Dr. Lisa Novak, and many more. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. This episode is brought to you by Coping Partners. Coping Partners is a mental health practice in the Chicago suburbs dedicated to helping children, adolescents, and adults. We help manage various challenges, including anxiety, divorce, behavioral issues, relationship problems, and much more. Check out more episodes of our podcast and our website at copingpartners.com, and you can contact us with any questions you have. Before we get into today's topic, I wanted to introduce our guest. Demi Agaiby founded Beyond Horizons Performance. She is a mental performance consultant for athletes and performers. With over 20 years in the dance world, she gets the unique struggles of athletes and performers. Demi has a master's degree in sport and performance psychology. Demi has worked with hundreds of performers of all ages in mastering their mindset and mental skills. So thank you so much, Demi, for being here to talk with parents about how they can best help their children and athletes. And before we get started, I would love it if you could kind of tell us a little bit about how you got into this line of work, your own dance journey, both the highs and the lows.
Yeah. So I started my dance journey like any young kid. My parents threw me in dance at the age of like 5, I think it was. And basically, I didn't look back since that time. Went on into high school, and that was when I basically experienced my first, what I later look back on as my first experience in sports psychology, personally speaking, because I experienced injury from overtraining. So basically, I was overtraining for auditions to prepare for college and ended up getting microfractures in both of my tibias, which basically, like, I couldn't walk. And so I was on crutches. Yeah, it was awful. Wow. And it was like, I think the reason why it was so significant for me was the timing of it. So I had worked my way right throughout high school of like, okay, I really am committed to dance. Like, I really want to continue this and put the effort into auditioning. And then right when audition season ended, I was literally stuck to not dance at all, right? And so there was this awkward time period where I was like waiting for acceptances, but then also on crutches. And so there was, it was a lot of just time for reflection. And, it led me to really find a deeper sense of appreciation for dance and solidified the fact that, yes, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. But, again, there's beautiful moments in the chaos and the unexpected. But it was in that moment that I think, I don't know if I wasn't injured, I don't know if I would have been so eager to continue dance. I think that was like a pivotal moment for me. And then it didn't stop there. I got into college. I got into Loyola into their dance program. And basically that injury kept flaring up. And so my freshman year, I basically was still mending that injury, which meant that I was taken out of all of the productions, basically all you can think of like the community, right? Like I was taken out of classes, I was taken out of things because I was spending a lot of time at physical therapy. And so I felt so isolated my freshman year. And I felt basically, by the time I reached my sophomore year, I was so burnt out because I had worked so hard on recovering from this injury that was just so persistent and so chronic. And without social support, without feeling like I was progressing as a dancer or as an athlete. So it was a really difficult time period for me. Then reached sophomore year and I was going to quit. I
Mm.
was like, I now looking back, I call this sophomore syndrome, right? Because I had reached a point where I was burnt out. And I remember sitting in my midterm meeting with my professor and looking her in the eye and saying, I'm tired. And I think she looked at me and she was like, "You're tired?" I'm tired too. And I have, X amount on my plate. But I now looking back, I know that that was burnout. And it's crazy for me to think that in that moment, I could have called it quits because I was burnt out. And that in
Mhm.
my mind, I was just like, no, this is just not it. It's too much.
Mhm.
Um, and basically, what ended up happening was this professor lent me this book called, oh shoot, Emotional Alchemy.
Hmm.
And that unleashed basically my introduction to the world of psychology and dance and how the two intertwine. It's basically about emotional intelligence, and it helped me basically pull myself out of that burnout in a really, really powerful way.
Wow.
And that led me down a rabbit hole where I just kept reading the books. And then I was entering my psychology classes, and I was like, I'm going to apply every single thing from the lecture to myself and to dance. And so, my peers saw me as, oh, the girl who's at the bottom of the totem pole is always injured, right?
Mhm.
And they saw me catapult into being like right at their level, like I didn't skip a beat.
Wow.
And so, yeah, that caused them to kind of like turn their heads, and people were like, what is she doing? What is she drinking? Like, I want whatever she's having. And then, people recognized that. And that's when I became basically a source of guidance and leadership. And I would just tell them the research that I read or the things that
Wow.
I was learning in my psychology classes and how I applied it to dance. Um, but yeah, I that was kind of, a very casual way that I entered the realm of sports psychology, and then literally in a Google search stumbled upon it, and I didn't even know it existed. It's a fairly new field. It's 1990s is when it kind of surfaced, and so it's fairly new. And I knew right away. I was like, that's it. That's exactly what I want. The fact that I can combine these two pursuits. So
Okay. Absolutely fascinating.
yeah.
So, how, I guess, what would you say, other than kind of just understanding that some of these mental tools, that you used kind of got you out of of this place from the burnout, from the
Yeah.
injury, how
Mhm.
would you say, like, what were the specific strategies that you applied for yourself in terms of how to transition, out of that injury besides physical therapy? Like, what were your mental skills to be able to get back into that world?
Not going down the rabbit hole. So there was a lot of asking why, a lot of getting deeper and deeper of overthinking and rumination as to why things were happening to me or why things were
Mhm.
not the way that I wanted them to, whether it was physically or mentally or just in my life.
Mhm.
Um, so being able to recognize that thought pattern
Mhm.
of, okay, I feel myself spiraling. I feel
Mhm.
myself going down that rabbit hole. Let me stop, acknowledge the emotion for what it is, not trying to suppress it, but acknowledging it, right? So a lot of emotional intelligence work, um, and then embracing that emotion for what it is,
Mhm.
rather
Not getting
than
sucked in.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And one of my, I think one of my strengths and also one of my weaknesses is that I like to intellectualize. And so there was a lot of that happening.
Mhm.
And so it was basically like, it is what it is, an emotion, I can experience it and I don't need to take it to the utmost degree that
Mhm.
it like completely takes over my mindset.
Mhm.
Um, and it was prominent, and even when I was training, it was like I wasn't there. Like my mind was just going, but I wasn't present. And so that kind of led me to then practice mindfulness in a really authentic way and appreciate the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so grounding myself in the joys of the everyday life and finding things that sparked my authenticity and what made me feel a sense of joy and happiness, right? And latching on to those things.
Right, because
So
you got
it,
into that, into being a dancer, right? Because of, I'm assuming, because of the joy
yes,
that you intrinsically felt as you were dancing. And so when you experience burnout, it's like you're so far from that, you have to kind of find your way back somehow.
yeah. And I think, I mean, I speak about this when I'm speaking to athletes or even to parents. I say, your why is the lighthouse, right? And so when athletes are burnt out, right, you think about it, the lighthouse, its job is to shed light on the water. If your boat is so far from the lighthouse that it can't see the light, how are you going to get to the shore? How are you going to get to your why, right? And so that's what happened to me. That's what happens to so many athletes is in the rough of a storm, they'll get pushed away from their why. They'll get pushed away from their lighthouse. And so a lot of the work that I do when I have athletes who are, burnt out or experiencing injury, I'll say, let's bring us back to this lighthouse. Let's bring
Mm-hmm.
us back to these whys because otherwise you're going to get lost out there and you're never going to reconnect with it. And I think that was another thing that really brought me to it brought me back to that fulfilling experience of dance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then honestly, I cannot go without saying like social support,
Mm-hmm.
huge.
Right.
I basically took it into my own hands because I didn't feel a sense of community or connection with the dancers because I wasn't in the
Right.
production.
You said you felt really isolated at that time.
I felt extremely isolated. It was very, very difficult. They're all talking about, um, this show and that show and costumes and this, and I'm in the theater. I'm watching everything. I'm not there.
Mm-hmm.
And I all of the complaining of, oh, we have this long night, and here I am, like I would
And all
die
you
to be
all you
in this
want is to
position.
have a long night ahead
Yeah.
of you. You
So
can't, right? Like you want it
and
so
that's
bad because you can't have it.
exactly. And that's the deeper sense of appreciation. But I basically took it into my own hands to create social support for myself. And, um, I just poured into those relationships, even if they were a little bit more outside of dance.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that was instrumental, which we know research shows, right, that social support as it relates to any transition, whether it's injury or retirement or whatever it is
Right.
really integral. So
Right. Oh, I
yeah.
love hearing how you applied all these things, for yourself. It's amazing before you had read, before you had really known.
Yeah, I didn't even know.
Um, so I
Yeah.
know you and I were speaking earlier, and you said you have a really fulfilling client you've been working with, who was injured but is doing really well now. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about Bethany, which is not her real name.
Oh, yes. Me. Yes. She basically, to paint the picture for you, tore her ACL, had the surgery, and then, which is very common in ACL, injuries, she retore it.
Mm.
Along that process, there was a lot of other things that happened that basically complicated her specific injury process and her healing process. And so she came to me after the second surgery. And basically, we started the first session just unpacking and being like, how did it feel for you to progress so much? She actually retore her ACL when she was um, testing for like her basically passing to pass the test. In PT, they have to pass certain tests. So she
Mhm.
was doing the test
Oh, God.
and then retore it. Um,
Yeah.
and having her sit with those emotions in a really visceral way and the discomfort that brought that whole experience brought on. And that is really, really important for any injury process, especially if it's prolonged, because there's a lot of talk about just get better, just keep pushing, just heal, just you're constantly going towards that like finish line.
Mhm.
And it can be exhausting, which is why, in these prolonged injury recoveries, there's a lot of burnout, is because it's a lot of stress mentally and physically.
Mhm.
Um, and we basically, I do this activity where I take a paper plate and I divide it into 6 areas. And I say, what are the areas that you want to work on?
Mm.
What are the areas, the mental areas that you think would be most relevant to you? And she basically divided it up into what she was struggling with. One of the things she was struggling with was avoidance.
Mhm.
She was really fearful of returning to jumping because that's how she injured herself in the first place,
Makes
right?
sense.
So
Right.
when a lot of the work that we did was, okay, in physical therapy this week, we're going to start jumping. I'm really anxious about it. How how do I manage this anxiety, right? And she filled that. A lot of it too was related to identity,
Mhm.
athletic identity. There was some mental toughness components, some burnout, some self-care,
Mm.
um, resilience,
So she's like
right?
mapping out the work for you of what she wants to work on with you.
Yes. And I like this approach because especially in where she was in her injury, I mean she's 16, 17, she's 17, where she was in this road place in her recovery, she knew very well like this is what I'm struggling with mentally,
Absolutely.
right?
Right. And when you say she was scared about the jumps, like the PT, the physical therapist wouldn't have encouraged her to do them if from a physical standpoint she didn't believe it was safe. But you're
Yes,
saying just mentally, it was a trauma when she injured herself doing the jump. And so the
exactly.
idea of I have to do that again, and what if that
Right.
happens again, was like keeping her from really fully engaging in that leap or
Yeah.
whatever. Right.
Yeah, and this is something that's so common, like return to play
Right.
for injured athletes, concussed athletes. We see this a lot.
I
Like,
bet.
okay, like what if I'm going back in the game, but who's to say that my symptoms won't present themselves again,
Right.
right?
Oh my goodness.
Um,
Yeah.
any injury, really,
Mhm.
there is a leap of faith that is required, and that can be very, very difficult. There's a lot of
Right.
courage that needs to be cultivated, and a lot of resilience that needs to be built. So yeah, she you know, we really focused on returning to like jumping.
Mhm.
And I can kind of speak to, I don't know if you'd be interested in hearing like the strategies that we used.
Sure. Oh, sure.
Yeah, so let's see, where do we start? We started with oversimplification. And this is one that she speaks to this day. She's like, that was the most pivotal thing for me. And I asked her, what is jumping like that you've already done? And she said, well, I can do like a single leg lunge. Like when I'm doing a lunge, I'm lunging onto one foot and I'm pushing off of my foot. That's similar. And I said, okay, what else? And I was just helping her connect the dots, mechanically speaking, so that she's able to understand, oh, wait, I can trust my body to
Mhm.
take this to the next level because I've already done all of this. It's
Mhm.
all I'm doing is I'm adding another layer, I'm adding another component, right?
Mhm.
So what you're doing in that oversimplification process is you're taking away the anxious thoughts
Mhm.
and you're bringing in a little bit more logic, right?
Mhm.
Like,
Mhm.
no, when you think about it, jumping is not much more different than walking. I'm putting
Right.
pressure on one foot and I'm taking off onto another. And that was a game changer. The self-talk of it's just fill in the blank. It's just
Right.
like walk. It's just like a lunge.
Right. And I've had
Was
success with all of these things. So
exactly,
I can do the scary
exactly.
thing. Mhm.
Yes. Latching on to prior success, helping her build that internal confidence and understanding that all of those moments are data points. And what I
Mhm.
do is I say, okay, I want you to log those data points, those
Mhm.
little mini successes,
Right.
that's data
Right. Right.
that I want you to use when you're asked to be courageous, when you're
Right.
asked to really step forward it's not like you're just doing it out on a limb.
No, for us in the world of, mental health, we draw exposure ladders or hierarchies, and they look like ladders with rungs. And you have the person go from like the baby, we call baby steps, from the least scary to the most scary. So if like taking that leap literally in your dancer's case
Yeah, no.
was at the top of the ladder, you would,
Yeah.
like you said, you'd have her say like, well, I've already transferred from one foot to the other when I'm walking, and I've done these lunges. And, you'd help her see that until it feels comfortable even imagining the jump, and then of course doing it. But it sounds like it's been really effective for her.
Yeah.
Neat.
Another thing that you just reminded me of was really interesting about her. She couldn't even visualize herself jumping.
Mm,
So this is something that we see is really interesting in injured athletes and athletes in general, right? So one of the tools that we can use to help build confidence is visualization, like closing your eyes and seeing yourself execute the skill, the task, whatever it is.
mm,
And for her, that the synapses just weren't connecting. They weren't firing. It just no picture was showing. And this is really interesting. That's one in a few that you'll get that,
mhm.
right? And it was because the fear.
Right.
Her brain was protecting itself.
Right. Wow.
Didn't want to go into that territory.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, which I thought was very fascinating from my lens to be like, okay, how can we work our way up to kind of embracing this and not seeing it as like a threat?
Absolutely.
Um, and actually another layer of that simplification process was like she was holding so much weight to going back to jumping because in her mind, oh my gosh, okay, once I start jumping, then I can go back to dance and then blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, it carried so much significance as it relates to her identity.
Mhm.
And what I needed her to understand and what we worked through was that it doesn't have to be related to dance. There was so much attached to that singular thing that was ramping up her anxiety
Right.
of what it meant for her future.
Right.
Right. And so a lot of the process too was saying, regardless of what happens in this moment, the
Mhm.
progress that I've made is still valid.
Mhm.
And who I am as a person with
Absolutely. And I was going to say, we talk about identity a lot in these athletes or performers because, of course, many of them have started at a very young age, and have done this like every single day or every single week for years and years. And then they, maybe they get injured or maybe they just don't make it to that level. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
what now? And
Yeah.
so I know we've spoken before about the goal of building this multidimensional identity. And
Oh,
again,
yeah.
I'm wondering if you can like speak on what do athletes or performers end up doing? What do they end up doing with all of these things that they've obviously learned
Mm,
if they don't end up pursuing that line of work, let's say from a career perspective. So if they don't become a professional athlete or professional dancer, it's not
yeah.
it's not a waste, but like how would you guide them to understanding what part of what they've done for all these years is going to actually help them in their future?
Yeah. So this is something called transferable skill sets and non-transferable skill sets, which is a really fancy way of saying everything that your athlete learns in sport transfers into another area of their life in the future, right? And who they are as a person,
Mhm.
right? So when they're in sport, they're learning leadership skills, they're learning discipline, they're learning how to respond to failures, they're learning how to problem solve, they're learning how to communicate effectively and work interpersonally, right? All of those things carry over into any line of work that they will go into,
Right.
right?
Right. These
I
are the
always
most
say,
driven people, the most hard workers, the most disciplined. Yes.
yeah, like I always say when I'm talking to like a captain, oh boy, when I'm talking to a captain and they have to kind of hold one of their teammates accountable, that conversation they're terrified. And I always remind them, I say, I understand that this is a lot. There's a lot of that's being asked of you as a captain. This is part of your job. This is part of your role.
Mhm.
And you are building skill sets for the rest of your life that
Right.
will carry over and
Hmm.
that will just catapult you further.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just
So
to remind, you
I was
know,
going to say, I don't know in the moment if the kid or teenager or even adult could like hold on to that. But, I would imagine that thinking about all that they have had to do to hone a skill and like you said, leadership and grit and all that, that's going to for sure be applicable to further pursuits in their life. And so helping them see that is going to kind of free them up a little bit if they're in a place of, like you said, depression or burnout and thinking that my life is over. Like, what else am I going to do? Like, no, we have to shift our thinking, and understand how this is going to help us in our future roles.
Yeah. And I think, something that I speak to is like, you want to create a common thread, right? So if you ask your athlete what they really loved about their sport, what they really valued or the lessons that they really valued, and then taking those, lessons or those things that they're listing and finding other ways that they can kind of still access those attributes, those factors, right? Because they love sport for a reason. And once they get really concrete on that, you can be like, great, so we can take this, something that you really loved. I love working in a team. I love being a part of a team. Great. Let's find other ways for you to be a part of a team.
Absolutely.
Right. And that helps build their identity outside of sport while still latching on to the things that they love about it.
Absolutely. No, I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about you'd said something about how athletes respond to failure experiences and feedback. And again, that's one of those things to me that's very transferable to other areas in life and certainly career. I'm wondering for our parent audience, Demi, because it's got to be very hard to be the parent of an athlete at this level. I mean, from just like the investment of time, emotion, energy, driving, money, all of going to games and stuff too. So what advice would you say for parents you can give to, I know we've had parents come into the office who are devastated when their kids lose a huge championship game and the kids seem really devastated and the parents don't know what to do. They're almost like frozen in that car ride home. What do you recommend for parents in terms of how they engage or don't their kids in conversation, how they help their kids make sense of that, adjust to it, kind of just, like move on? What would you say for parents out there?
Yeah. First things first, strategize, right? I think that at the beginning of the season, the most powerful things that you can do with your athlete is sit down with them and say, look, it's not going to be a smooth ride out there. There are going to be moments that you're going to come home angry, disappointed, frustrated, annoyed, tired. Let's expect that. Let's anticipate that. There are going to be games that you're not maybe going to play your best. Maybe you end up winning, but you don't feel your best, right? Or vice versa. Maybe you end up losing and you played your best. Whatever it is, let's anticipate the struggle. And now that we've anticipated the struggle, as the parent, I want to make sure that I can support you in the best way possible when those struggles happen, right? And I love this strategy because it gives the parents a little bit more of a game plan as opposed to like, oh no, they're, gripping the steering wheel like, oh my gosh, what do I say? Do I not say anything at all? And it's just like, okay, walking on eggshells here.
We've
At
rehearsed this
least
before. We know what to do.
yeah, they've had an understanding of like, okay, this is what my athlete needs from me in this moment, right? And asking the athlete, when you come home like this, or when something like this happens after practice or after a game, what would you like from me? What do you need from me, right? Give the athlete the opportunity to speak to what they need, and that will help kind of give you a role, a sense of responsibility. And it gives you a sense of relief too. And then always, I would say, like when those things happen, right? You say, hey, we have a game plan. I know we talked about our game plan. And I also want you to know that if you need anything else from me, I'm here. Right. So when those things come up, allude to, hey, I'm going to follow protocol. I'm going to follow, we talked
but
about
I'm flexible if it feels differently.
Like that. If there's something that, because let's be real, like, yes, we can strategize. And in the moment, they could be like, actually, mom, I really just need to vent. And that's okay.
Right.
So,
Well, and actually, again, that idea that, in any in anything we do in life, right? Especially if we put our heart and soul, like there will be times that we, experience failure. We can't
Yeah.
win every single game. Professional athletes don't. So, of course, they can't. And there are real gains from coping with disappointment, from, eventually listening to feedback and working differently, But I think that it's hard for kids these days to experience feedback. And often they get defensive or, they often really don't respond beautifully to a lost, a failed game. So I think it's good that they're experiencing that, but it's also important that we have empathy and patience because it sounds like, for a lot of these kids, it's hard. They've been so good at this sport, they've typically only received accolades before for what they've been doing. And now they're like the big leagues and they might actually not be the best player on the team or not score every goal and things like that.
Yeah, and I just spoke to a group of parents about this like a few weeks ago. And one of the parents said, after a significant loss or rejection, my daughter takes 3 days. And she knows, she's like, my daughter takes 3 days. And after that third day, she's good, right? And I think, and I love that example because this individual was late high school,
Yeah.
right? And I said, that's amazing. Now I want to hear back from you in like 3 years because that process of 3 days to cope might go down to one.
Right. With more
That's
practice.
resistance, right? The
Mhm.
psychological adaptation to stressors.
Mhm.
So she might not need that full 3 days to cope,
Mhm.
but she'll need that maybe half day. She'll know what she needs to do.
Mhm.
And then it's like, okay, let's get back up and let's do
Right.
the thing.
No,
Yeah.
that's actually really neat.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking about again, like a little bit off topic, but I think it's relevant for parents these days that
Mm.
kids these days seem to be starting sport earlier, younger,
Yeah.
and they're I would say pressured to choose a path earlier than they used to be, rather than like trying a little bit of everything. Um, and I again, as a parent, like I see it, I see the signups,
Yeah.
the anxiety goes up, right? But I wonder about, your perspective on this shift and kind of like how good or bad is it for these kids? I know there's been recent books written on this topic, but kind of again, any suggestions for parents, even of like preschoolers, and elementary school kids? Because again, early on, it starts like, do I show them a little of each or do I have to pick one?
Hmm. Exploration and curiosity are two, and I do consider these mental skills are the mental skills that I have seen basically deplete
Mm-hmm.
over that year. I would say probably since COVID, especially, right? And that I think that is characteristic to this idea of like I have to choose a certain pathway and I have to stick to it. What we also see is when, an athlete sticks to a specific sport and they reach about the age 15, 16, and they realize that they're actually not as interested in it anymore, right?
Mm.
And they experience a sense of fear to leave it because if I leave this sport, that means I have to start all over and it's way too late for me to start over, right? I can't do that. Everybody else has already figured it out and I'm going to start something new. I'm going to learn something new. No way can I do that, right? This is something that we call identity foreclosure. Basically, you want to think about closing the door on your identity prematurely, where
Mhm.
an athlete at 15, 16 is like, no, my identity can't evolve anymore. Like, this is what it has to be. And so I guess I'll just suffer through it because God forbid I learn something new. Right.
Mhm.
And so those are, two of the things that I've been noticing. And I work with clients on this too of like, okay, you've done this thing for X amount of years. And maybe it's time that this commitment evolves. Right.
Right. And if it's not fun anymore, right, that's also concerning because how are you going to work this hard at something you're no longer enjoying and not
Yeah.
lead to burnout? Or is someone else driving you to continue down this one path, right?
Right.
Are your parents
Right.
so invested, like they have spent all this time and energy, building you up so you could get that scholarship for college, right? And so it's tricky, but you have to figure out, is the intrinsic motivation still there, or
Yeah.
not? And like you
Yeah.
said, there are a myriad of positive outcomes that come with trying new things, even in high school. but it feels scarier for them. They might not be very good at it, or they might, they might not have the skill set at that point compared to other kids their age. So
Right. Yeah.
a lot of that.
Yeah. I would say, to parents, explore the young ages, 10 and under, explore as much as possible. Right. So, and if they tend to like a certain activity, great. And you can put that at the top of like the priorities, but make sure if they're 10 and under to have at least two underlying components, whether those are just hobbies, activities that their energy is still feeding into, right? So this could like gymnastics is like the top thing, but then they have piano once a week, and then they are in the play at school,
I was going
right?
to say that's where the school activities are really helpful because it's kind of like built in. And then you
Yeah.
can, decide for extracurriculars, one or two things.
Yes. Yeah. And then once they get into high school, I would say take pull from them of like, what did you actually really enjoy? And let's keep that triad, let's keep that triangle,
Mhm.
but let's make it a little bit more substantial. And so yeah, maybe gymnastics is still that thing. Maybe it's not piano, maybe it's choir,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or maybe it's student government or leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always making sure that the triangle exists
Yeah.
in some, because there
No,
are off seasons in sport, and so they're going to
that
need
makes a
something
lot
to
of
do.
sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and again, it's so interesting, like for you personally, right? You were a obviously very successful serious dancer, but now you are in a line of work that integrates, right, that dancer
Yep.
identity and your
Yep.
coaching. So it's, it's like
Yeah.
there's lots of things you can do with your sort of past life to integrate into your future career or future chapter. But I think for kids and teens in that moment, it feels like if I'm ending this chapter, and then they get paralyzed by that fear. Like what happens next?
Yeah. And there's so much, a lot of, I think one of my favorite things in the world is when like an athlete comes up to me and is like, I had no idea this line of work existed.
Yeah.
And like, thank you for showing me that,
Mhm.
because then it becomes something that they're like, oh, this is an option for me. And that's where the exploration and curiosity, the traditional lines of work maybe
Mhm.
don't give way to how they can integrate sport.
Mhm. No, it makes a lot of sense.
So many ways to do
Yes.
it.
If you
Yeah.
could give parents one more piece of advice, as they're on this journey and assuming they have a teen or a kiddo who is excelling in a certain sport, what would your advice be to them?
Mm. Continue to praise effort and bring awareness to the process. So, yes, in their success, there's probably a lot happening, probably a lot of accolades. Continue to make observations that you're witnessing.
Mhm.
I love when I see you work through something really difficult. I
Mhm.
love seeing you work with your teammates and
Mhm.
come out with a win.
Mhm.
Bring their attention to the process.
I was going to say we give talks for parents and we say focus on the process, not the outcome. And it sounds like that is exactly what you're saying, which is reinforcing my thoughts on the topic.
Okay.
But yeah, like they have very little control over not every single leap, twirl, outcome. That you're helping them with that, but ultimately it's like what can I control? And if the parents are praising the effort, if they're praising the hard work, if they're praising the organization that went into packing up all the equipment that they needed for the day to have success, right? All of those skills, again, are what's in the person's control and what will help them in life. Whereas, again, if they played a good team or a bad team, if they won or lost, that may be out of their control. If the rest of the team did great or not, they can focus on the process and being specific with praise, not just good job, but what am I praising?
Yes, that's a huge observations and using those I statements is
Mm-hmm.
really huge. And I mean, from the kid's perspective, wow, mom and dad are actually seeing me. Like they're not just
Yeah.
seeing me, they're seeing the process. They're
Mm-hmm.
seeing me in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah. And whether it's
Yeah,
sportsmanship, commenting, or leadership, like you said,
exactly.
that's just as important. Or like, I know you didn't get to play today and you were on the bench and that must have been hard, but I loved how you supported your teammates and had a positive attitude. Like even something as
Exactly.
simple as that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's great. I'm wondering for parents listening as we wrap up, if they're interested in learning more about these topics, what resources of any kind would you share with them? And it could be podcasts, books, articles, anything.
Yeah. So I would definitely say, well, I'll kind of connect you with my podcast. My podcast is Performers on the Rise, and you can listen to that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Another really great podcast is called Finding Mastery with Michael Gervais. He's a sports psychologist. Absolutely incredible. And he also has a book. I actually haven't had a chance to read it yet. Fear of People's Opinions, the fear of
Ooh,
people's opinions.
that sounds like it
Um,
could be good for everyone. Not
oh,
just
absolutely.
athletes.
I'm sure it's incredible. He's an incredible resource.
Mhm.
And then as it relates to books, parents, if you have not read Grit by Angela Duckworth, please, it is like a must read, and you probably will find yourself picking it back up multiple times.
Yeah,
And then there's also this book called I Can, The Teenage Athlete's Guide to Mental Fitness. That's by Dr. Josephine Perry. And this one is a lot more hands-on, applied. There's some activities in here that you could even do with your athlete that are really incredible. And it's shorter. Angela Duckworth's Grit book is a little bit heftier.
but that's a
So
classic. It's okay.
yeah, but this one is definitely has a lot more applied activities that you can do with your athlete.
That's awesome. No, thank you. Thank you so much. And your website, maybe tell the name of your website.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at Beyond Horizons Performance, and then my website is also beyondhorizonsperformance.com. I'm not sure when this will be airing, but I am still accepting one-on-one clients. And up until basically mid-January, I'm offering a slight discount to jumpstart January, essentially. So winter athletes, that's going to be for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything, Demi, for sharing your journey and giving parents some advice on how they can help their kiddos because it's not easy. And everyone, please check out more episodes of our podcast. Go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And thank you, as always, for tuning in.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.